Hi there, it's Wednesday, March 4th, day 52 of the 60-day legislative session in Olympia. A week from tomorrow, set to be sunny day. Plenty to unpack in today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. I'm Carleen Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. So late on Tuesday, we got word that Governor Bob Ferguson had sent a letter out to supporters, apparently from his campaign, not from his governor's office, but from his campaign. Maybe you're always campaigning, that said the income tax bill may not be ready for passage this year. Then we're going to get into a bill that is moving forward, most likely, to eliminate cities and local jurisdictions' ability to decide how to handle the homeless and drug crisis in their communities. This would say the state comes in and tells the cities, you have to put a homeless shelter here. You have to put in, drug crisis and permanent supportive housing for folks that don't have a place to live. And even if that's an area that's zoned residential, the state is going to tell the cities, you still have to put this in your community. Plenty of resistance to that bill, but at this point, it appears to be moving ahead. And then we're going to get into something that's been relatively quiet this legislative session, and that is gun control. We've had some sessions where there's been half a dozen bills that are moving forward that gun rights supporters, brought a lot of opposition to. One that is still alive this year that has not gotten a lot of attention is going to increase fees for background checks before you get a concealed carrier, before you're able to purchase a firearm. So we're going to have reaction to that one. So let's dive right into today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. So those reports started circulating late in the day on Tuesday, suggesting the income tax bill, millionaire's tax, Senate Bill 6346, may not reach the House floor. Remember, it's already passed the Senate. The reports that were circulating were that Bob Ferguson had sent a letter out to donors and supporters of his campaign that basically said, getting it right means we might have to come back next year and finish this. So it might have to come up again in the 2027 legislation. As you can imagine, that's kind of a big deal because there's been tons of opposition to this tax, even though it is positioned to be a millionaire's tax on income, 9.9% tax on income above $1 million threshold or combined household income in excess of $1 million. But of course, a lot of the opposition comes from folks who say there's no reason to believe this is going to stay a tax on millionaires. It could, they're going to need additional revenue, especially if this leads to capital flight, as the estate tax was already doing, which is why they're rolling that back with other legislation this year. It might have been the result of the fact that some big tech companies were publicly blasting the bill just this week, releasing a letter on Monday that warned the income tax, was not going to be good for development, not going to be good for future business investment in the state of Washington. And that was signed by some really big, prominent tech sector folks from the Allen Institute, from Reed AI's CEO, and some folks from Microsoft's AI division. They were saying, don't move ahead on this income tax, Governor Ferguson. Maybe that's what inspired his letter to donors yesterday. Maybe it's just positioning to sort of light the fire under some more moderate Democrats on the House side that at this point, I'm told, are not in favor of the income tax. They may, according to GOP Chairman Jim Walsh, from what he told me on Tuesday, House Democrats may not even have in their own caucus the necessary votes to get this across the finish line. So maybe this is positioning by the governor to create a sense of urgency. That remains to be seen. It's going to be super interesting to see what happens in this final week. And then we reached out to the office of Senator Manka Dhingra. She's one of the sponsors of Senate Bill 6346, Democrat from Redmond. And critics are noting that past statements going back to when she ran for office initially in 2017, she was very vehemently opposed to a statewide income tax. She was very pro-business. There were articles published in the Seattle Times, in ProPublica. There were many times when she spoke in public, and she was asked directly at the time about Seattle's head tax. That was what was in the news at the time, even though she wasn't going to be representing Seattle. She was asked about it. And so right now on her campaign site, there's a Q&A question, and her response is worth noting. We're going to put this up on the screen. Here's what it says. The question posed by someone was, Senator Gingrich, did you vote for the Seattle head tax, and do you support an income tax? And you can see there, she begins a response to say she's never lived in Seattle, never worked, nothing to do with the head tax. But then she says, I believe we need jobs. We need the business in our communities to thrive. We need innovation, technology. We need to advance. But we also have the most regressive tax structure in America. I do not support the implementation of a state income tax, and such a policy has been deemed unconstitutional. Of course, that seems to contradict many of the public statements she's made since the income tax was introduced this session. My guess is that she would say she doesn't support a statewide income tax on all levels of income, but supports the version that we have now before us, the millionaire's tax, that many opponents believe would eventually hit all of us in the state of Washington. So that's the update on that. Now to House Bill 6. This is not also gotten a lot of attention, but cities across the state of Washington might soon have no choice but to allow subsidized housing, emergency shelters, permanent supportive housing in their communities if this bill passes. It's already cleared the House, and it could be pulled to the Senate floor at any time. And what it would require is cities and county planners would, within their urban growth areas, would have to allow this transitional housing, this permanent supportive housing. And if you don't understand what that means, or it's kind of, sounds like a lot of bureaucratic speak, this is the cities like Plymouth Housing and other taxpayer subsidized hotels and housing facilities, a lot of them in the city of Seattle on 2nd and 3rd Avenue, where you've got, in most cases, drug addicted and or mentally ill folks who are given housing because they're on the street and they have no place to live, often because of their drug abuse. But it's not a carrot and a stick approach at all, because these folks are given housing without being forced to say, yeah, I want to get clean and sober. I want to get into treatment. I want to go to job training, partner me with a mentor that can help me turn my life around. And so a lot of communities in the last couple of years have pushed back on what's this housing first model, and said, we don't want this. It's not working. We see the failures in Seattle and in Spokane and some of the other big cities where housing first has been the model for years. And so they've passed their own, ordinances or zoning restrictions to say these can only go in certain places. Sponsor Strom Peterson on this bill, Democrat, said in a committee hearing when he was testifying in support of this bill, he said, I'm going to read from his quote so I don't mess this up. He said, we know there's a housing crisis in Washington, and it's a housing crisis that goes across all economic ladders. This will set a standard across the state so developers know what to do. So his contention was this bill is going to make it easier for developers of subsidized housing projects to know what the rules are. But that's not really what the main takeaway is from opponents. Opponents are saying, wait, you're telling me I have to put emergency shelters and a permanent supportive housing in a residential zoned community in my backyard. You're going to do this in Maple Valley and Ording. You're going to do this, in lots of communities where there's a lot of resistance to this. So last year, when we at the Center Square were preparing an explainer video about housing first, and the model of putting, these drug addicted homeless people into housing without a requirement that they turn things around. We did that explainer video because it was meant to be a sincere look, a very sincere look at the issue, not just from the perspective of folks who say it's compassionate to put them in a house and not require them to turn their life around, but also from folks who say, we've got evidence it's not working, and there's nothing compassionate about giving people a place to die just because it's inside. So I want to share with you part of a conversation I had with a man considered to be the father of Housing First, Dr. Sam Sambaras. And he still believes in the approach that he championed decades ago. But you must remember that when this Housing First model was initially championed, it was getting chronic street drunks, off of the sidewalks. It wasn't the fentanyl crisis that we have of today that's literally killing people every day in our communities. So here is part of that conversation with Dr. Sambaras.
The question is it better to have people dying on the streets or to have people dying when they're in their own place? I mean, people are going to be dying. There's overdose deaths everywhere, whether people are homeless or not. And there is no data that compares the number of overdose deaths of people who are homeless versus people who are housed. It's not like the expectation that simply providing someone with a roof over their head is going to take care of all of their problems is maybe one of the misunderstandings about housing, what Housing First is about. It's like, all we want to do is have the person be safe, have the community be a safe place to be, and we have a shot at helping them get better.
And this morning, I caught up with Andrea Suarez, founder of We Heart Seattle. They have for more than 5 years now been literally picking up the trash, the drug debris that's left behind in homeless drug camps all over the city. And she is sharply critical of the Housing First model and this legislation to basically expand that to communities, even when there's been resistance. Here's part of what she told me this morning.
It's just bringing drugs into the neighborhoods. Like, it's really just simply that. It's drugs and a warehousing of people with different disabilities, whether it's untreated mental illness or physical disabilities or co-occurring disabilities, all together is chaotic for the neighborhood and chaotic for the people living indoors. I actually interviewed a couple guys living outside of a DESC door stoop the other day, and they said, we walked out of our housing. It was so bad. They're evicting themselves at this point because they're like, look, there's crime, there's pedophilia, sex offenders, rapists, drug dealers, and there's not a snowball's chance in hell that you're going to go into one of those environments and be like, I think I'll get clean and sober today or work on my best path forward when the fox is guarding the hen house. It's awful. And you've got daycares and libraries and bus stops are overridden with people using, dealing, littering, loitering, and you've got your little old ladies with their wheelchairs and kids trying to get to and from. It's just so chaotic where these buildings are, and if there's no guardrails as to where they should be or within 1,000 feet or 1,000 yards from schools, daycares, I mean, really, honestly, anywhere. It's just enabling addiction, chaos, crime in our neighborhoods, no matter where they are.
So again, Andrea and other critics, the Discovery Institute, very concerned about this legislation that, again, has not received a lot of media coverage. Very worried that this is the wrong direction that the state needs to be going to address this crisis. Doesn't matter where you live. It seems like we all see it every day in our communities. So we're going to follow that one, let you know as soon as that passes out. And then if this is implemented, we're going to follow that as well to see what the consequences are. All right, so now let's move on to item number 3 for today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. This is House Bill 2521. Already cleared the House, on the Senate calendar, so that means it can get pulled for a vote at any time. And gun rights supporters are not going to like this one. Again, this is another one I don't think has gotten a lot of attention this session, but 2521 removes the cap on fees the State Patrol can charge for firearm background checks. It also expands how those fees can be used. And critics say it could really make legal firearm ownership unaffordable for a lot of Washington residents. And they believe there's some real constitutional issues here. So I spoke today with Kirk Evans. He is the president of U.S. Law Shield. It isn't like the bill, one doggone bit. U.S. Law Shield, if you're not familiar, they help people in cases where it's self-defense and maybe somebody had to use a firearm. That is a difficult legal landscape to navigate. So they help folks. They do a lot of other things to kind of promote self-defense for folks with firearms, especially in communities where we have low policing numbers, like in the state of Washington, where we have the lowest number of law enforcement per capita. So he questions State Patrol's contention that they need this bill because $18 for a background check fee isn't going far enough. So here's part of that conversation I had today with Kirk Evans of U.S. Law Shield.
It is a great, great bill if you have no understanding of how government functions and how the real world functions. It sounds, great that we're going to have a tiny, tiny increase to help pay for the costs of reviewing these permits, and doing that will help expedite the ability of people to get firearms. Right? That all sounds great. Unfortunately, that's not the way. As we know, governments don't work like that. Expenses don't just go up, tiny, tiny amounts. One of the folks testifying at the Appropriations Committee meeting gave the example that in his district, the shellfish farming fees just this year went up 500%. So that's how things work. And then the other, a whole bunch of the other folks testified on sort of real world concerns about the bill, which is, let's take a domestic abuse victim, not well to do, trying to get away from her abuser, just finally makes this step to leave and wants to get a firearm to protect herself and has all these other expenses, got to find a new place to live, maybe babysitting, things like that. And then boom, you get hit with the giant expense just to try to, protect yourself. So that's, in the real world, in real government, this is certain to become expensive and more difficult.
During testimony on the bill, Washington State Patrol had their legislative liaison testifying. She said, that background check division relies on $18 alone to handle it. They claim it's not enough. And without more funding, the backlog of checks to process this will grow. It'll take longer to get your background check approved, and then longer, to obtain your firearm or your concealed carry license. So they contend this is actually good for gun owners. Here's part of what that Washington State Patrol liaison shared with testimony in Olympia.
Our Firearms Background Division is funded entirely by statutory $18 fee for each background check. That fee was based on projections that no longer reflect current workload and no longer cover the actual cost of operating the program. House Bill 2521 would remove that cap and allow the State Patrol to set the fee at a level that reflects actual operating cost. Fee adjustments would be based on documented expenditures, workload analysis, and limited strictly to cost recovery. Without that flexibility, we will not be able to sustain current operations. We process over 22,000 background checks each month. More than 10,000 require manual reviews. Currently, those checks are completed within 6 to 12 days. Without sufficient funding, it would take longer to complete background checks. Backlogs will grow. Processing time for manual review checks could expect 12 months by the end of fiscal year 27. Extended delays would affect dealers, courts, law enforcement, members of the public who rely on the background checks process. For these reasons, the State Patrol respectfully urges your support for passage of House Bill 2521.
There was also a lot of testimony in that same hearing in opposition to the bill, including from Jane Milhans. She survived a home invasion several years ago and has since become an advocate, especially for women. She holds firearms training sessions for women, and her contention is, be prepared to protect yourself, because whether it's a home invasion or, another scenario where you might not be able to wait for law enforcement, to save your own life or the life of a family member. So here's part of Jane Milhan's testimony.
I'm the survivor of a home invasion by 2 men, and because of that, I became a certified firearm instructor and volunteer all my time to train women how to safely protect themselves. Because my classes are reasonable, my fee is, my clients are normally, or students are normally fixed income widows between 60 to 90, single moms, and other low income people. This bill, although it's unconstitutional, will create a burden on this lower income group that I teach. And next year, with all of the money going to the Washington State Patrol for required permits and other things, it's going to make a constitutional, under Article 1, Section 24 of the Constitution, unattainable by this whole sector of society. So I urge you to vote no on this bill.
So again, that is House Bill 2521. If you want to follow that legislation and see where it's at, again, it's passed one chamber, could be pulled to the other chamber in the Senate at any time. Plenty of opposition to this legislation, although several Republicans did support it, realizing that State Patrol maybe needs some more help. Important to note here, remember, last year was passage of the permit to purchase bill in Washington State. It has not yet taken effect. It is set to take effect in, I think it's May of 2027. So we're still over a year from implementation of that bill. That was one of the most contentious pieces of, chipping away at gun rights in the state of Washington, if you will, that we've had in many years. That one is going to require State Patrol to run a second group of background checks. So it's like you're going to have to apply to get a background check, and then you're going to at your county office or local law enforcement, and then if they approve it, then it's going to go to State Patrol, and they're going to have to do another one. There's also going to be a requirement for some firearms safety training, and State Patrol has already said, we don't got what we need to implement this whatsoever. There are legal challenges out there hanging in the mix as well. So State Patrol could potentially be overwhelmed already by the background checks and need some more funding so they can put more folks in that program. But when the permit to purchase law is implemented next summer, it's going to be a whole different ball game. So we're following that closely. And Kirk Evans with U.S. Law Shield is also watching that legislation very closely. So I appreciate you watching another episode of Washington in Focus Daily. We're back in Olympia on Thursday, which will mark second to the last Thursday, because it's Thursday, March the 12th. It's set to be the last day of the legislative session, assuming they can come to some kind of budget agreement and get us out on time. Appreciate you watching. I'm Carleen Johnson. Check out our Center Square page, thecentersquare.com/Washington for my stories and stories from my other Washington colleagues. Appreciate you watching.